Shadow people, the Hat Man, creatures of the night, the old hag. What are these beings and what exactly do they want from us? Are they a figment of our imagination, a trick of the eye, or are they something else, something sinister with an ill-intended purpose towards us, or just beings from another dimension that have penetrated our veil of reality? Shadow people are a more recent entity that have been showing up around the world for a few decades now. They are mostly seen out of the corner of our eyes, the shadows of a dark room, or on our sight for a split second and then with the blink of an eye are gone. But in some rare terrifying cases they tend to make their presence much more valid to a select group of individuals. In this video I will delve into some of the theories and submitted stories by witnesses to these beings to find out what we could possibly be dealing with when it comes to this phenomena. This first story is submitted by a woman named Ingrid C. She had been seeing shadow people for a very long time. She remembers in her old apartment she would often see shadows scurrying into her room and other rooms from the corner of her eye. Her first actual contact with these shadows did not happen until she had moved into her current location. It was 1998 and she was 16 at the time. After a long evening of church, everyone was exhausted and they had returned home around 6 p.m. She remembers being very tired and going to bed around 7:30 p.m. She had fallen asleep very quickly and began having a chasing nightmare. As it is with these nightmares, right before you are caught by whatever it is that's chasing you, you will wake up in a startled panic. Just as Ingrid was soothing herself back to sleep, she noticed a tall dark figure resembling the shadow of a man standing near her closet by the head of her bed. The shadow was distinctly darker than the black of the room and could easily be seen. She noticed bright red reflecting eyes were gazing at her as well. She was startled and frightened as a sense of evil and fear consumed her. While staring at it, the being walked towards her until it was standing next to her bed looking down upon her. Seconds later, the shadow reached his hand out and plunged into her chest and began to pull out a bright silver cord or rope from her chest. She could feel herself almost floating up as he did this. She remembered thinking, "Oh my God, he's trying to take my soul." Immediately, she grabbed the cord as well and began to have a tug-of-war with the thing. For a while, the shadow creature was winning. Ingrid suddenly remembered that the Hail Mary is supposed to defeat demons and evil, which she assumed this was, and began to recite it in her head over and over. Within a few seconds of doing this, the being stopped and looked down at her with a gaze of pure hatred. She heard it say, "You've won this time, but won't be so lucky next." The shadow did not physically speak. She heard the voice in her head. After saying this, he opened his hand and the cord zipped back into her body like a rubber band that had been stretched. It slammed into her so forcefully that it bounced her entire body on the bed. However, the shadow creature was still there, gazing down upon her. The next thing she remembers is waking up and cannot fully explain the experience. She was awake when the attack happened, but still felt like she had woken up. However, the creature had vanished. Needless to say, she was quite shaken by the whole experience. Later that night, as she was trying to go to sleep and thinking of her experience, she felt the side of her bed sink in like someone sat down. She did not open her eyes but prayed and eventually did fall asleep. Since then, she has been plagued by things trying to open her door at night, shaking her bed at all hours, strange things moving in the corner of her eye, and always around the same time of year. Now, there are a few things with this story that I wanted to point out, one being the red eyes. This is not a common feature with the cliché shadow person that is usually seen, but it is very common with demonic entities. Also, the issue with the whole ordeal with starting with a nightmare. Not all shadow people are seen when dreaming, but other evil paranormal entities are tied greatly to the astral or dream world. And third, the silver cord that the being was trying to take or sever can be related to what some call the tether from our physical bodies to our astral bodies, or basically the physical and the spiritual world. So this leaves the question, was this a shadow being or something disguising itself in such form to seem like one? Or do creatures from different realms only appear in shadowed form to us because our perception cannot fully recognize them? There are many types of theories on what we could be dealing with. Tricks of the eyes, but why human form? Demons, some type of parallel universe being that slipped into our world? But how? Many theorists have come to the conclusion that with the heightened electromagnetic interference in our modern-day world, we have inadvertently opened gates to realms that we are not normally intended to see into. For instance, a good example is when you look into the night sky and stare at the stars, just to find that you can see some of the stars through your peripheral vision only. This is because some stars are only visible through gamma, infrared, or X-rays. Our eyes cannot directly pick up on these waves of light, but with the influence from outside sources such as telescopes or strong interference like magnetic disturbances with the natural flow of things, it is possible to see these things. This is what potentially is causing the mass sightings of shadow people and other entities within the recent years. Which brings me to my next story. A popular paranormal radio show host and possibly the greatest radio personality of all time by the name of Art Bell was sitting at his home broadcasting studio one night, which is filled with a substantial amount of radio equipment. It sends out and receives all kinds of very strong frequencies and signals. It was late and he was doing work on his computer when he noticed out of the right corner of his eye something tall, dark, and moving slightly. When he turned to see what it was, to his amazement and fearful shock, it was about a 6.5 to 7 foot tall shadow being standing in the room with him. The shadow being very quickly faded, and Art chalked it up to a trick of his eyes from staring at the computer for a few hours that night. As he went back to his monitor, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye to the left this time. His heart sunk as he turned to see a large shadowed being facing towards him, and this time it was very apparent that it was not an illusion. He stared for a few moments when all of a sudden the being rushed towards him and went through his body and faded away. Art was left shocked, startled, and on the verge of having a heart attack from the entire experience. Now, to me, this is a perfect example of what we could be dealing with as far as dealing with the electromagnetic frequencies and maybe, opening doors to paranormal realms that we wouldn't normally see and that we haven't seen previous throughout history. It's pretty obvious to me that, maybe because he was focused on these certain subjects, that maybe it manifested a little easier. I don't know. I don't know if mind really has any influence on this, or spiritual or religious beliefs, or if maybe just being in the wrong place at the right time is a huge factor in it. Now, the past two stories were interesting to me because the first one, the woman or girl at the time, had just gotten back from church, where it's commonly said that if you focus on certain areas, good versus evil, you might open doorways to one or the other, whether you want to or not, whether that's your intention or not. Art was focusing on paranormal broadcasting. Maybe his mind was focused on that, and that's why he got the cards dealt that he was given. It's hard to say, but either way, they were both focused kind of in those realms, and that was one of the key things that I noticed through both of these stories. Now, the next story and subject that I'm going to lightly touch on is the Hat Man, which is a very common incident that occurs with children, which is kind of startling, and more than often happens after they wake up from a nightmare or just randomly in their sleep in the middle of the night. And the Hat Man, much like the Shadow People in many qualities, has actually been taking place much longer than a few decades, like the Shadow People. When I was doing my research, I found that a lot of these stories were from back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. This next story is a story submitted by a woman named Rebecca. It starts out, my sister and grandmother were sleeping in the bed like normal, and I was sleeping between the two of them with my head at the foot of the bed. I had had a terrible nightmare where the dresser drawers were opening and closing on their own and ghosts in clothing were flying out. Rebecca remembers herself dreaming in the same places her body slept. Most dreams are in other places or familiar places, but never from the perspective of where you were actually sleeping, she said. I woke up from the dream very afraid. Terrified, she gently kicked, trying to wake her grandmother, but couldn't rouse her. I debated getting up and finding my mom, she said, but I would have had to walk past the dresser from my dream and decided it was too scary. I turned my gaze away from the dresser and up to the window behind the headboard of the bed, and that's where I saw the man. He was a dark, looming figure and seemed to stand on the headboard, but Rebecca soon realized that the man stood behind the headboard and was extremely tall. He was wearing a long flowing coat, a top hat, and carried a cane. He had no real features but was a solid object that blocked the light from the window behind him. Rebecca was terrified because there was something else in the room, but she could not recognize him as human. Rebecca and the Hat Man stared at each other for what could have been minutes or seconds when the figure lifted his arm and pointed at her. He said, "This is your last chance." Rebecca said his voice did not fill the room. The best way that she could describe it is that it filled her head. The voice was flat with no residual sound, as if everything surrounding the words had been removed. And after the Hat Man spoke those 5 cryptic words, he put down his arm and disappeared. She told her family of the encounter the next day, but they paid very little attention to it. She didn't bring up the Hat Man encounter again until her early teens. This time her family actually listened. Everyone believed in ghosts, so it was another neat ghost story for the family members and everyone except for her aunt. She said this is because her aunt had more than one ghostly encounter, all eerily similar to her own. She said she had seen the same man in the same house. Although the fear of her grandmother's room has long since gone, along with the terror of that long ago moment when she saw the Hat Man, she still can't figure out one thing. What did the words mean? Were they a threat, a warning, or a piece of advice? She may never know. All of these stories and accounts tell me a few different things. There is a strong relation between these entities and our sleep. The fact that there are more recent issues indicates that something has changed in the world for all of these accounts to surface so quickly and all have the same qualities. Much like UFOs, aliens, or ghosts, there are just too many similar stories and encounters to just dismiss the issue as something conjured up in a hoaxer's mind. Whatever we are dealing with seems to have somewhat of a negative vibe to it, although nobody has ever reported being physically harmed. Some say that these entities feed off of fear and dread, much like the stories of the black-eyed children, in which case they are just interdimensional beings that have come here for ages just to feed on our emotional stress, and we are just now in some way being able to occasionally see them. Most accounts of people noticing these beings state that the creatures are just as shocked as we are when they notice that we can see them. Whatever it may be that we are dealing with, one thing is for sure, it is definitely something that we could all do without ever having to experience. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe, and stay tuned for more videos like this one.